Is Barbara Butcher. Barbara, it's great to have you on the radio. Thanks for joining me.
Oh, thank you so much. That is my real name. It was probably the best gift my father ever gave me for my profession. Butcher is a great last name.
No doubt, especially for your line of work. If people are unfamiliar with your history, you were the chief of staff and director of the Forensic Sciences Training Program at the New York City office of the chief medical examiner. I think that you were the first woman ever to serve in that role. You're a renowned expert in medical legal death investigation and spent 23 years in the to the chief medical examiner. Aside from the last name, Barbara, what made you want to get into that line of work?
Oh, a very strange childhood. I when I was a kid, I was obsessed with finding out why things occurred, and in particular, why death occurred. So the neighborhood kids would bring me their roadkill that they'd find, and I had a dissecting kit and a chemistry set and a microscope. And I would look at the little animal and cut them open to see what happened inside. And then I'd say something like, well, notice the 3 squiggly black lines across his back, and we see that the chest cavity is crushed with bleeding. That means he was run over by a car. Amen. So, yeah, that was pretty easy to figure out. But my parents, they actually supported my strange little curiosities and bought me, one Christmas I got a frog in formaldehyde, and then for my birthday I got an eel.
Whoa.
Which was interesting. So, yeah, I had that kind of thing. I was always looking for clues, always looking to figure things out.
So, Barbara, obviously, a lot of what you deal with is science and medicine, but you're also, you're human. You're dealing with the fact that the people that you're examining in many instances were formerly living and are now dead, sometimes in very horrific circumstances. I would think that death investigation is emotionally very taxing work. How do you develop the resilience to handle the grim realities that you faced daily?
Oh, you're absolutely right. Early on, I was told that you have to detach from your emotions. So when I walk onto a scene where there's perhaps a mother and child murdered, my first instinct is shock, horror, terror, grief. And I'm no good to them if I'm in that state. I'm no good to the victims. I've got to get justice for them and answers for their families. So I shut down, detach completely from my emotional reactions, and then do my work. Early on in my training as a death investigator, I was watching the autopsy or observing the autopsy of a little girl who'd been murdered. And it was gruesome. It was awful. And I asked the forensic pathologist doing the case, I said, how do you live with this? How do you do this every day and still manage to go on? And she said, Barbara, you've got to surround yourself with things of beauty, music, art, love, nature. And you've got to do that every single day to counteract the death, despair, and destruction you're going to see on a daily basis. Well, at first I thought that was some real hippie nonsense, but I soon discovered that she was right. I got a little house in the country and fixed it up, and I felt so much better because this stuff haunts you. It stays in your brain forever, and it stays in your heart. I remember coming home some days, and I couldn't bear to be me knowing what I knew. And I'd strip off my clothes and throw the bed sheets over my head and just try to forget. It was an awful feeling. And, I don't mind saying it still haunts me to this day.
I can imagine.
The cops I know, the detectives, they feel the same way. It hurts inside.
Yeah, I don't know how I'd be able to cope with doing what you did for decades. That's incredible. If people are just tuning in, we're talking with Barbara Butcher. She is a medico-legal death investigator and the author of What the Dead Don't Know. Barbara, I want to talk to you about your book in a moment, but let me ask you about what I mentioned at the top of the segment: the explosion of interest in the true crime genre. What's behind that? Has it always been there, or is it what I perceived, that a genuine uptick in the amount of interest in this field?
Oh no, it is. It's a huge uptick. I remember when I was a kid, there were magazines, True Detective and things like that. They were mostly read by men, and they were about, crimes that occurred, homicides, how they were solved, and they were kind of sensationalist. But this latest, it's an absolute wave of interest in true crime. Part of it is that we have so much more access now to, the photos from cases, the details of cases, because of social media and television. But the interesting thing is that now the true crime fan base or market are middle-aged women. Women, I think the average age is about 55. And everyone's wondering, why are women so interested in true crime? And I have one little theory that perhaps because we're vulnerable, and perhaps because so many crimes are, like they say, the husband did it. Wife is killed by her husband who's philandering or having an affair. And learning about true crime is a way to protect yourself. You see the subtle signs of a spouse that's, having an affair and looking to get rid of you. You know the forensics, how cases are solved, how cases are prosecuted. And you learn a lot, and it feels protective somehow. I kind of go with that.
I like that. That's very thoughtful. It seems to make a lot of sense. I mentioned the Homicide series on Netflix that you're involved with. Another thing on Netflix that has gotten a lot of attention of late is the documentary involving JonBenet Ramsey. I'm sure you've been asked about this 100 times, but do you have a take on the JonBenet Ramsey situation in general? And does the resurgence of interest in this case because of the documentary, does that make it any more likely that we'll ever know the truth about what happened here?
We just may. I mean, someday we're going to find out, but it could take a hell of a long time. I'm asked a lot about this case, and, my theories have gone back and forth at least 6 times of who might have done this. And having watched that documentary recently, I feel that the fact that the little girl was dressed up and sexualized as a woman for these pageants, these beauty pageants. Very disturbing. You see the videos of her in full makeup and acting seductive. 5-6-year-old girl, that doesn't feel right. And it's known that many pedophiles try to attend these pageants to slip in or, pretend they have a child in the pageant and watch the kids. So it would not be difficult for one such person to track down a little girl who he was particularly taken with, find out where she lived, and then attack her. What bothers me... Go ahead.
No, please, continue.
What bothers me is the report of the trauma to JonBenet's genitalia was said to be chronic, and that throws us way off. Does that mean she was sexually abused by someone before this murder? But yet, the medical examiner reportedly did not do histology, which is where you take a sample of the tissues, put it under the microscope, and see have there been repeated trauma? Has there been healing of that trauma? to prove that it's been chronic. So that's way up in the air, too. But I strongly feel that it was a pedophile. Having seen her in a show, spectacular.
What about the other case that's been making news? Just yesterday, there was another a victim charged in the Gilgo Beach killer, Rex Heuermann. A lot of us that had covered this case for a while were wondering why it was taking so long for them to arrest someone for the Gilgo Beach cases. And then now they just seem to be believing that more and more bodies are attributable to Rex Heuermann. I realize you're, more in the scientific end than the detective end, but what are your thoughts on the Gilgo Beach situation?
Well, I think it's it's horrific, but it's also fascinating that 10 sets of remains, 10 women, and one possible transgender person I've heard about. It's remarkable that he could have gotten away with that for so long. And I ascribe it to the fact that the victims were largely sex workers. And I've heard occasional, back in the old days especially, the remarks about, it's a public service killing. There's so-called throwaway victims. No one's looking for them. They're living on the margins of society, and that's how it's easy to get away with that. I recall in the early 90s, we were getting 2,400 and something homicides a year. Now you're lucky if you get 400 in New York City. But 2,400 homicides a year in New York. And so I was running from one case to the other. It was absolutely remarkable, how many homicides I saw back then. And so many of them were so-called, not my term, but throwaway victims. Prostitutes were killed regularly, strangled on a rooftop, smothered in a motel, stabbed in the dark alleyways. And how are you going to trace anything about them? If they live on the margins of society, we don't often get the information we need about the victim to find out who were her associates, who did she know, who were her regular customers. Really difficult to trace, almost anonymous killings in a way. So the fact that these victims were sex workers was, to the detriment of the investigation. And I don't know, I feel like the Suffolk County Police Department at that time did not take all the measures they could have. A little sloppy.
Let me ask you about your book before we run out of time. It's called What the Dead Don't Know. The title of your book is pretty intriguing. What don't the dead know, and what do you hope the living will learn from it?
Frank, I hate to tell you, but someone misinformed you. It's called What the Dead Know.
Oh, What the Dead Know. No, actually, I was just misreading my own handwriting here. That's my error. Sorry about that.
Well, they know everything, frankly. The main thing they know is how they died. And it's my job to interrogate the dead, to examine, to investigate, to find all the evidence that leads us to who did it and how it happened. And, every I call it the choreography of murder. There are patterns. There are things you can see in an apartment or a home that tell you where the killer was standing, like blood spray, for instance, or blood spatter. Where were they standing? Where did the weapon come from? Did they bring it in? It was a kitchen knife. And who was the victim? Why did they fall victim to this particular killer? So every scene tells you a story of how this happened. So the dead know not only who killed them, and then they're going to tell me by my investigation, but they also know something that has always intrigued me, and that is the moment of infinite regret. I don't know if you ever did something a little foolish, perhaps, and then just let's say drive speeding down the highway. You lose control of the car. Just before you hit that tree is this flood of regret. Like, why did I have to speed? Why did I have 2 drinks? Why? And then boom, you hit. Maybe you're crippled, maybe you're killed. But I feel like everyone who dies, not just victims of accidents, homicides, or suicides, has this moment of regret. I hope I don't have that moment. But I feel like they think, oh, why did I do this? Or why didn't I live free and happy and absent of worries? I wanted to enjoy my life more.
Barbara, really enjoyed the conversation. I hope you'll come back. There's a lot of other subjects that I'd like to explore with you, from your role in the aftermath of 9/11 to a lot more about your book. But we're going to have to end it there. I hope we can chat again.
Me too. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And if people are interested in Barbara's book, we've been talking with Barbara Butcher. Again, that's my error. I'm looking right at my own notes, and I wrote it down incorrectly. It's I misread it, What the Dead Know. And you could get it on Amazon. Its author is Barbara Butcher with 2 T's. You can also check out her website. A ton of interesting content on there. BarbaraButcherOfficial.com. That's Barbara Butcher with 1 T, official.com. I guess my wife is right. I might be time for reading glasses. BarbaraButcherOfficial.com. All right. What the Dead Know. If you want to comment, whether you're dead or alive, you can certainly give me a call.